Hello and welcome to a video series where we look inside the Figma design team, engineering team and product team. Today we have some designers, engineers and representatives from product, and we're going to be talking about process. Alexia, I'm going to come to you first. What do you think the biggest challenges are for designers in the industry at the moment when it comes to process?
So I can mostly speak from a European perspective. I cannot speak for every design team out there. But if this was a couple years ago, I would have definitely said siloing was the biggest challenge that we had. It really felt like a lot of teams here would work in sequence from a team that would arbitrarily sort of design preemptively a solution to the problem space to then deliver it to designers who would just put a nice little coat of paint on it and then finish it off by throwing it over the wall to some developer somewhere who would just take it and do their best to make it happen in code as close as they could to the actual design files. We've made loads of progress. There's still teams, I think, who are struggling these days with siloing, mostly due to internal organizational structures that are just taking a bit of time to go through that change management. But we've definitely made heaps of progress when it comes to designer-developer relationships, I would say. So I think it's pretty acquired at this stage now that designer and developer just need that conversation at the very minimum on technical feasibility. That's something that I think I'm seeing with most teams. Why I still feel like there's a bit of space for improvement is I think in the maybe earlier part. So if you assume that engineering work and design work should really start all the way at tackling the problem space that's defined for a feature. Right now I feel like that collaboration and those processes run slightly smoothly when it comes to the implementation, but I think there's still a lot of space for progress when it comes to shaping the feature and sort of being more part of that roadmap together with maybe the bigger product team and even beyond the business teams.
From the Figma perspective, as a designer, do we have a design process?
I mean, yes and no. I think if you say, do you have a process in terms of this like structured for every project, we start with this and then we do this and then it ships in this way, like no. But I think a lot of that is because the range and breadth of projects that we're working on at Figma has like changed and grown massively. I was thinking back to like Config 2022 and like our headline feature was launching dark mode. And then the next year we launched dev mode, which was kind of a new surface. And then this year we launched slides, which is like an entirely new product. So the difference in scale of each project kind of determines the process. And I suppose if I think about the process, you're kind of like, well, how do we decide what we're going to work on? You know, how do we kind of brainstorm, plan, listen to users and prioritize that work? And then I think where it gets really interesting is where you're kind of in this shaping process, which you were kind of talking about, that earlier collaboration, where we're sort of planning out how the thing is going to, like, the general shape of like what it's going to be. And then you've got that kind of actually designing what it is. And I think that's kind of where people think about like wireframes, like UI design, handover, and then the implementation side of it. So yeah, like we have a lot of rituals along the way that kind of play into that. But yeah, there's not like a single process that is correct to follow. I think it really depends on the features and the scale of what you're trying to build.
And from the product perspective, how do you facilitate this infinitely flexible process across small features to entire products?
Yeah, well, at previous companies and even before using Figma, there were a lot more specific product process things that you needed to do when design and engineering were much further apart. At Figma now and at past companies where we've used Figma, it's so much easier to bring engineering into the design work earlier on rather than waiting for a finalized spec or something that's only shared out at the end. So for example, at Figma, we have, depending on, again, the size of the project, but we have a lot of different rituals for either bringing engine early on in the ideation phases where we're just trying to figure out what types of solutions might be appropriate for the problem that we're trying to solve, all the way up through using engineering prototypes to solve or to decide what the right solution is. So on some of the features that we've worked on recently, the best way for us to actually nail down like what we would classically call something like a design spec is actually to have engineering start building something, use that to figure out the nuances and the interactions and how it actually feels in practice. And then, only then, after engineering has been heavily involved, do we actually get to the point where we can say, yes, this is exactly what we want to build and ship. Here's how the details are going to work. So even though we don't have like a one-size-fits-all process for everything we do, we're very flexible for the type of feature that we're building or the scale of the feature that we're building to pull engineering and design very close together early on in the process.
Yeah, we have a relatively light process in terms of project management. And teams really have a lot of ownership to decide how they want to run their project. So some teams prefer to run sprints. Some teams don't want to use any task tracking at all because it's just like a designer and an engineer together in a Zoom call or in a room polishing details and improving the product or an iteration. And the way we usually interact outside the team to talk about how a project is going is milestones. So we do have milestones when we hope to ship a feature for internal dog fooding, which is something that we do a lot and we learn a lot from, or a milestone to ship a feature for a beta or for production for GA, obviously. And I feel like these milestones are like at the heart of our process, which are like the check-in points and the way that we can still communicate to stakeholders, like, are we on track? Are we at risk? But without having a too prescriptive method of this is how you should run a project in your team.
What you're saying, though, resonates with what I've seen some of the, I would say, more quote-unquote mature teams around doing, which is that they don't strictly define the scope of the role of every person. They just say, you're going to pair up. So for instance, typically that would be like a PM and a designer that own a specific scope of a product. And what that relationship looks like and how they organize their processes is not imposed by the organization at all. They're kind of left to figure it out by themselves. And in some cases, the designer might be the one doing a lot of the user research because they have an appetite for it. The product manager might be more focused on delivery. Sometimes it's completely different. Sometimes it's a very UI-oriented designers with a very research-heavy product manager. And they kind of just trust that the people they've hired will know and understand how to best work amongst themselves. They don't impose that, which I think is interesting. You know, there's this meme with almost like the bell curve. I feel like there's no process on either end and there's a lot of process in the middle. If you have no process, maybe it's not a good sign, but also some of the more mature teams don't go that heavy on processes. So it feels like that resonates.
I feel like that makes a lot of sense too, as you sort of like go along the like trust curve as well. So like at Figma, to exactly what you're saying, there are some projects where it's like very engineering led. On our team right now, we have some projects where designers focus on other work and an engineer can build and prototype and even write the PRD and be the one driving user research. And because we don't have such a fixed process, we're able to like, people can step up and take on the right work that they need to do to push the project forward, even if we don't have a designer who can work on that project right now or product is focused on something else. Because we like don't have to adhere to such a strict process, we can be flexible to do whatever is going to work in the moment for that process.
Do we not typically have a shape of a team for each individual piece of work? Is it kind of flexible based on what you decide to build?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of projects end up in a similar shape. It's not totally like every project is so unique, but we do have. I think you could distinguish between like an engineering-led project where maybe there's a lot of technical challenges, or we need to do a lot of prototyping first just to be able to understand the space. There's some projects that are really research-heavy, and maybe the thing we end up building is not going to be technically difficult or even that hard to design, but we really need to understand the users really, really well. So we might be more focused on the research side, working closely with user research or running research on our own. But then there are a lot of more typical projects where product design and eng are all collaborating, and design and product are a bit more involved at the beginning in shaping the solution, and engineering comes in a little bit later on to help figure out how it's going to work and if there are going to be technical challenges. But yeah, the ability to keep it relatively flexible does mean that, like, I don't know, people come and go and teams grow and shrink and personal things happen in your life, and it's great to have, like, I know that if I have to be out for a week, Noga can push a project forward even though I had been pushing it forward. So like having that flexibility where it doesn't have to be one person in one role, like managing each specific piece lets us like keep our momentum even through all sorts of things going on.
And this definitely also has challenges, like the fact that we don't have a clear process, and sometimes we end up finding ourselves like, oh, are we reinventing the wheel here? Like I wish we had like a playbook for how we do that. And at some point we were even like, ooh, writing a PRD is actually like a good idea. Like maybe that's actually useful to do. So I think it's definitely to find that balance of having the ability to run things free form, but also remember that, oh, we need to make sure that stakeholders have visibility to what we're doing and that we as a team are all aligned and that we're going through the motion in a way that makes sense.
I think that's a really interesting point about kind of the extra overhead and cognitive load when you have to think like, oh, I'm at this stage of project, how do I move it forward? Like, and you're sort of almost designing the process ad hoc, and that's like absolutely exhausting. So I think when I think about process and like what a good process should do, it's very much about like creating this enough structure that people are set up to do their best work, where they kind of have like this safety and predictability of like, well, I know in 2 weeks' time we're going to do this, or I know I have this regular check-in and I can discuss that then, as opposed to like, should I send a Slack message? Should I like leave a comment in Figma? Should I write like a document and share this out, or should we set up a meeting? So I think like, and it also plays into like this whole thing of trust, where you're trying to, when you have a high trust within your team, people have more autonomy. They can like think more clearly, they can do better work. So I think the process is very much about like putting in place these predictable rituals where you're facilitating that trust and you're helping the work to move forward. So yeah, there's quite a few rituals that we have, both within our kind of like product teams, which would be like the DevTools teams, and then also within the design teams as well. So
yeah, I think it's good to have process and it's good to have rituals, but I feel like our process is always work in progress, and we always are very open to discussing it and changing it, and we're constantly having those conversations of like, do we need to have more meetings? Are we having too many meetings? Should this be in a FigJam file? Should this be in a doc? How should we be changing how we work to better suit what we need right now for this project, for this group of people?
How do you build teams to work in an environment that maybe is very different from previous environments, that perhaps what Alexia was touching on earlier with the siloed nature of a lot of teams? How do we find that talent and facilitate the new way of working for them?
Yeah, Figma is a collaboration tool, so I feel like it naturally draws people that want to work in a collaborative way. And I think even if people haven't done it before, they're usually really excited about the opportunity. I think at Figma, an engineer is not just an engineer, and we all do what needs to be done for the project to be successful. So we have engineers running user research sessions, and we have designers reviewing PRs, and everything is a bit of a mix, and this is what I love about Figma, and I find that usually people enjoy it.
Yeah, I think we're super highly collaborative, and I think we have a very high bar for hiring people that I like to work in that way. And I think sometimes if you look at the process, you're kind of like, I don't know, does this scale? Like we're not very async. Like we have even despite us kind of being across time zones, there's just a huge amount of like just a jamming culture, and so it's kind of like, let's work on this together. And I think in programming, it's much more usual for developers to hop on a call and do a pair programming session, and that's like an accepted way of working. But I think one of my favorite things is like the jam culture that we have, where it's like you just like put an hour or two on the calendar and say, hey, do you want to jam on this? And you work through it together, and I think it really helps to move work forward in kind of like you don't have to account for all of those decisions like after the fact. You can kind of make them in real time, move forward. You have someone like sort of taking the overview. You can be in the weeds, you can swap around. They're kind of like spotting things. But that's not just designers. Like that's kind of like, let's hop on a call with an engineer. You know, sometimes there's an element where really rigid process, like when there's a bug, we file a ticket in this way and we follow this format, and you must like describe the job to be done for that ticket, like, but it's maybe just like a spacing bug, do you know? And there's this kind of accumulation of like tiny implementation or design debt that can creep its way into the product. And one of the things that we find super useful in that is to like, hey, let's put in like we actually did this for when we were working on kind of the workflows features that we released at Config last year. And we put an R with an engineer who was super front-end detail focused, and it was me and another designer and Roshan, and we just like worked through polish bugs. We're like, whatever we see, and we worked through it in real time. There wasn't this like, you have this backlog of quality tickets to get through. It's like we all see, oh yeah, that's like howling. We need to fix that. And we'd fix it in real time and make the PR, and it would be on staging like that afternoon or the next day. And so you had this really like quick feedback loop. But when you had like big problems that you were trying to solve at the same time, like really gnarly engineering problems, it's really hard to prioritize those tiny quality tickets. So just time boxing that to 1 hour, you had this, you knew that it was going to come along, you knew those things were going to get fixed. And that just like, to me, that is process. You know, that's like, we're not putting in like having tickets as our process, but we're like having collaboration or having these kind of structured chunks of time to address certain quality aspects. So.
From the product perspective, how do you balance the sometimes very shifting, this is what we're building, or this is the priority, or this is what the company direction is, when you've got such a flexible way of deciding what maybe you're even going to build,
Yep.
compared to maybe your previous roles where it was more structured, more rigid in, this is the ticket, we take the ticket, we execute the ticket. How do you manage that, and what advice would you give to somebody who maybe isn't working in that way?
Yeah, well, I think it kind of goes back to Pete and Nogo were talking about with like having some rituals and some checkpoints. So, I mean, Figma culture is such that things are moving a lot. So it's not surprising to other stakeholders when we say, hey, we were jamming on this thing and we actually decided, you know what, we want to change this feature a bit, or this thing that we had talked about last time, we updated you, we've gone in a different direction. No one's totally caught off guard by that, but you do need the like predictability of the touch points to talk about that. So if we were doing all of this quietly, heads down, without sharing out to anybody else, that could be pretty disruptive. Especially at Figma, there's a lot of product work that overlaps with each other. So we're working on some features for dev mode, but that doesn't mean that other teams working on features that touch the toolbar or touch all sorts of variables. All of these things have an impact across both dev mode and other services. So there's both the like, we need to be providing updates and letting people know what we're working on so they can make sure that the features that they're building and all play nicely together, but also we need to be like getting that information from other teams. So I think compared to previous roles where like maybe I would spend a lot more of my time really defining exactly how something was going to work up front and like getting an official stamp on that and then like sending that out, and then that was kind of the end of it. Everyone knew what we were doing. It's much more of an ongoing process here where I'm meeting frequently with other teams, with other product managers to learn about what they're working on, to understand how their work is changing over time, and also to share out what the latest is on our work. Every team wants to know what we're building and how that's going to impact the things that they're working on. So it's a very like ongoing communication loop. And I'd say we're still figuring out some of the details on what the best format is for sharing these types of updates, and especially to Pete's point, as Figma has grown and taken on more and more larger projects and more types of products, there's more of that communication that needs to happen. So we're still, I wouldn't say we have it perfectly figured out what the right way is for everyone to be in the loop on exactly the right things, but that's a big part of what I see my job as, is making sure our team has all the information we need about what else is going on across Figma and providing the information about what our team is doing to everybody else. Not just stakeholders, not just like upwards management, but horizontally across the other product teams.
And is there a particular cadence to when that happens, how that happens, or is it, again, dependent on which feature you're building?
I mean, we do have some checkpoints. So like every 2 weeks, we're sharing out an update that says like, hey, here's sort of at a high level the things that our team has been working on this week. And that's a good way to bring executives or upward stakeholders along. We have a like pretty strong Slack culture. So we have like a Slack channel where when something makes it onto our staging environment, you send out a message and say, hey, we're working on this feature, now it's available to you on staging. Even if it's going to be months before we ship it to customers, that's another opportunity both to see the message or to see the feature on staging. Sometimes you say like, wow, when did this thing make it into Figma? And you go look in the staging launches channel and you see, oh, yesterday this new help menu came out, or this new feature that's something that now, oh, I should follow up with that team and see if we have some overlap, and maybe the thing that they built, we can use it for something new in what we're trying to solve. So there are some like regular cadence pieces, but then there will be projects where it's like, we need to jam on this a couple times a week, or we need to, if things are moving very quickly and decisions are being made, we don't want to wait around to hear about it later on, so I'll meet weekly with a team that we know we have more overlap with on what they're working on. So if there's a team that we really do think, extensibility was a team that we were working really closely with early on in dev mode as they were building out some features for dev mode, we were meeting with them every week just to stay in the loop and make sure that all of our decisions were caught up with each other.
And on the engineering side, what does that look like for you? Is it daily stand-ups? Is it end-of-day wrap-ups? Is it end-of-week wrap-ups? How do you approach that?
Yeah, so unsurprisingly, again, this changes a lot between project to project and a time of year. So we have Config, for example, which is our annual conference, and usually under rundown to config, like our whole process and weekly rituals would look very different than what they might look when we're early on in a project. So I would say that changes. I think what we usually do is we do have daily stand-ups per project, which are mostly an opportunity to both unblock each other, either if engineering or design or product questions come up and we want to make sure that everyone has everything they need to do their job. And I think that these are also great opportunities when product can give that context. Like we can talk about, oh, I learned that this other team is doing something that's relevant to us. What are the next steps we want to take there and how we want to continue from that.
Let's maybe jump into the weeds a little bit and talk about files. Under design files, hygiene, how you structure that kind of stuff. Alexia, I know you've got opinions on file management. You've even written an article about it in the past. So I'd love to share some insights on your approach to file management as a designer.
Yeah. I mean, so the article was before dev mode came out, and I do think dev mode has kind of reshuffled the cards a little bit, but the principles probably would remain the same, which is if you're trying to think of your files as artifacts for creating that transparency and that visibility for your work, you really need to think discoverability. They need to be easy to find for folks. You need to think about readability. They need to be easy to navigate. And then they need to give context around why that thing is there and where does it fit into your broader products. So without necessarily giving very pointed recommendations on how that should be implemented, I think these are very, very important. And especially when it comes to developer collaboration, obviously now we have ready to dev view, so that is kind of going in that direction of creating a space dedicated to having very clear legibility on specific designs. But I think one of the things I found really useful that I try to advocate for teams, generally speaking, is working in user flow and really creating that context of not just thinking about individual frames that are static assets, especially if you're in a team that doesn't necessarily have that communication around it. For teams like ours at Figma, where there's that big Slack culture, there is that constant communication, maybe we don't need to add that much context in the artifacts because that context is happening outside of the file. But for teams who are a little bit further apart, I think, thinking of ways where you can contextualize design decisions you've made, and making sure that anyone coming into the file understands the user journey from A to Z. This is where they would start, this is where they would end, this is why this looks like this in the middle, these are the different edge cases that would exist, I think is really, really powerful. So just general file hygiene tips.
I feel like even for teams like ours, there is, like we always talk about having this moment in time when we decide this is what we want to build. And then even if the process is very collaborative before that point, after that point, there's still this point in time where you want like a Figma file that represents what we're going to build and that we can align around. So I feel like that's useful even for teams as collaborative as ours.
Mm-hmm. How are your files, Peter?
I was just making some mental notes when Alexia was talking there. My files are notoriously a bit chaotic, and it's probably something I need to scrub up on. I've always kind of viewed my Figma files as these kind of ephemeral artifacts, and they're where their job is to communicate just enough information in order to move the product forward in the way that it needs to be. And sometimes when you have that super like high trust relationship with engineers, you could sketch it on a napkin. You could like just sit down beside each other and describe with words, and that would be enough to move the thing forward. And that's fine when you kind of have that, but that doesn't really serve other people within the organization, or help like with transparency in terms of like what you're working on. So I think there's like increasingly this move to like, well, can my file reflect our current state of thinking? And I don't always find it easy to like take the time to distill all of that knowledge and thinking and conversations that have happened into like this is the state of the work on Thursday. And so if anyone comes to the file, they can see like, here's all of the decisions that we've made. But I think that we have some rhythms within our kind of product and design process that can be a forcing function to like make you think critically about that work and kind of do an edit and distill all of your thinking into like a snapshot in time. So some of those would be, we have regular design crits, which is where normally a designer is kind of part of the product team. So like I'm part of the DevTools team, but I'm also part of the editor design team. And so we would have design crits like twice a week, and you bring your work and you sort of show it to the rest of the designers. And that's a really interesting time to get like feedback on your work. So the context setting that you're going to do there is a little bit different to like if you're preparing for say a product review. So that can like identify lots of opportunities, but that's also a great opportunity to be like, here's the current state of thinking, here's all the open decisions that we're thinking about, and here's what the kind of the option space. And you get lots of feedback, comments, and like real-time riffs in those crits, which are great. And then we also have product workshops. And they used to be kind of like mini product review things, and then we sort of reframed them to be workshops. And so they're kind of like working sessions with kind of our pillar, which would be DevTools. So they're a really good opportunity to kind of pull together all of that context, a little bit of the storytelling, and then just do like a kind of real-time working session. So that is another kind of like page that always exists in my files, is like product workshop and design crit. And then like at a higher level, you would have product reviews. So that's kind of like what is like the really high level kind of vision-y storytelling part of this. And it's getting into like decisions that we need to get from kind of leadership and sort of C-level to kind of move forward with kind of some of the spicier or larger decisions that would impact other teams.
So elevate from napkin through to
yeah,
many pages in a file.
Absolutely, but I think it's like some people just love like creating these kind of like perfect files with like lots of consistency across them. That is not me. There was maybe a time in my life when I did, but like so I need those like rituals and cadences and checkpoints in order to kind of like push me to kind of stay on top of my file management. Yeah.
I think that speaks to, I think that speaks to like what we're discussing with file hygiene. It kind of touches on that notion of source of truth. And with a source of truth, there's that tension that exists with, if you're over-indexing on that, it almost becomes a problem of documentation. And then the more effort you put on that, then you create a lot of maintenance for yourself as well, and it becomes a really big overhead, and you still want to keep things lean and agile on some level. And so I kind of like what you're saying with that, how you're not compensating, that's the wrong word, but how you're kind of offsetting some of that into a more ritual-based approach with some specific touch points that you can carry some element of we consolidate, just not as a permanent source of truth that we have to maintain all the time.
I love the scrappiness of this. Like, I feel like it's also sometimes in engineering, like we have a weekly show and tell session for the team where engineers, designers, anyone really can just demo or share their work that they did this week. And this is like, I love this because it's okay to share anything. Like, things could be so early on and so unpolished, but you can still share them and get some feedback and get some visibility to your work. So I feel like being able to share work in progress and not having to like bring something to perfection before letting others see it is actually really important. And I think it's it's not as easy for some people, and I think it's a really important skill to have.
Yeah, if we take the napkin at the bottom and then this engineering presentation at the top, we start to think about the flexibility or definition of what a prototype might be. So what is your definition of a prototype?
Yeah. One distinction is like engineering prototype or design prototype. So you can build a prototype in Figma to help communicate how you think a flow should work or to show how certain interactions might feel. Much easier to do that in Figma than to actually build that feature fully out. But sometimes the thing that you really want to learn from the prototype is actually like, how should these detailed interactions feel? So for one example, last year we shipped annotations in dev mode where you can attach notes basically to different layers on the canvas. And in doing that, there was a lot of detail about how they should be positioned, how they should grow and scale as you zoom in and out, as you move around the canvas, how should they appear. And no prototype that we built in Figma or talking about this with stakeholders, we got lots of opinions, but there was no way to know, how is this actually going to feel in practice? So one of my like favorite engineering prototypes that I've seen was one of the engineers on our team built an annotations prototype that had like built-in controls for tweaking all of these different settings. So I could say, oh, actually, I want the annotations to hide at 70% zoom level, and I could bump that up to 80% and say, that doesn't quite feel right at 80%. Okay, let me bump it down to 70. Okay, yeah, that is actually what I want. And if you're designing that's not necessary for everything you build, but especially a lot of the things that we build at Figma are so interaction specific, and the way it feels and the way it works in practice and like how fluid it is a really like core part of the functionality, especially compared to other past companies I've been at where interactions, if you're working with like a spreadsheet or something, there's not quite as much nuance in exactly how something zooms in or out. And so using engineering prototypes to answer those questions, it's also a good way to bring people along, but it is a really great way to just get to the actual definition of like, yep, we want it to exactly at 70% behave like this, and we want the annotations to be this big, and dragging these little sliders around it feels so hand wavy, but like there isn't a formula for figuring out exactly what size this is going to feel right at relative to your design that you're annotating. So sometimes those prototypes can be really powerful. But I think just the regular Figma prototypes are often a better way to communicate with like a group of stakeholders, like here's how this feature is going to look. You're going to click over here and this thing is going to pop up. You don't need every detail of exact scaling and exact animation to convey those types of things. So I think you have to use the right tool for the job depending on what you're trying to do. Are you trying to communicate, or are you trying to answer a question? Are you trying to make a decision? Those have different ways to solve them.
Yeah, when I'm thinking about prototyping, I'm thinking about like what question are we trying to answer, and usually it's what is the most ambiguous part of this project, or what is the thing we know least about and we want to learn more. So I think sometimes it's like, how is this interaction is going to work, and can we actually build an experience that will be in a good enough quality? And sometimes it's, is this technically feasible, or is it going to take us months to build this, and then maybe it's not worth it. Like maybe we want to learn about technical feasibility, and that's also something that we do a lot. I also love when we prototype in code early in the project, because I feel like it's a really good way to make sure that, or to allow for engineering and design to move together at the same pace of the project. So again, not have like design and product work on something and then hand it off to developers who will then see it for the first time at that point, but to really start from napkin sketches and progressively move together to something that's high quality, high fidelity on both functions.
I also, like, selfishly, as a product manager, estimates are like one of the things that are always like challenging and stressful. Like everybody wants to know when we're going to be done with something, and if engineering hasn't seen it until the design work is done, we can't estimate how long it's going to take. But if you're building as you go, or maybe there's a feature where we think, oh, this this seems like it's going to be really hard. This is going to take us 6 months to do. And we spend a week doing engineering prototyping, and the team comes back and says, actually, we could do this in a month. We could do this in 2 weeks. That not only do we like now have a much better estimate, but that actually changes our strategy. Like if we think that this thing is really valuable, but maybe not valuable enough to spend 6 months on, that's a very different calculation than this is going to take us 2 weeks and it's going to be very valuable. So I think when you are able to pull engineering in and start doing some of these prototypes, there's like a really nice just like process improvement where you're not like totally blocked on understanding how long could this take. And I feel like our team in particular does a really great job of that, where I feel like I have a rough idea of how long things are going to take even before we've finalized the PRD or before we have finalized designs. We kind of know how long it's going to be, and that allows us to roadmap and sequence things in a way that makes sense rather than like finding out last minute, oh God, this thing that we just got excited about and designed is going to take us a year to do, and do we really want to do it now that we know it's going to take a year? Like, just having that information more up front is like a big benefit to the team and to the whole org. Like, you want to know how long things are going to take. Everybody always wants to know that. So yeah, I think the eng prototyping also pays off in that direction, just by learning more about what's going to go into building the feature up front rather than at the very end of the rest of the process.
Yeah, I think like building features in Figma in general, there are always layers of hidden complexity that we don't know what we don't know when we start. Like I can't tell you the number of like simple features that we've kind of said we could just ship this thing and we're just going to add this thing and we'll put it on staging like next week and see how it feels. And it's only when kind of the design spec is done, or the design is done, and it's very easy in a design, in a static screen, or even in a design prototype, to make, like, for example, annotations look gorgeous, right? But we're not in control of what the content is and how many annotations people put, how much their screens are spaced apart. And it's only when you actually play with that in code that you're like, that's not great. And so sometimes there can be a reluctance then, like you could go the index the other way, where like everything is really, really hard. Like, and you suggest something in a meeting and you're like, no, we couldn't do that because what about this? And what about that other thing in the editor? And we can't add things there. And so that then becomes exhausting. You're like, do I have the drive to actually push through this? Do other people have the appetite to kind of make this happen? So what I have found kind of works well is like there's this, I think there's a real culture within Figma of like storytelling and selling a vision and kind of getting people excited about something, and kind of painting this picture of the potential and what this could be. And that's when people get excited. You get energy and momentum behind a project. And sometimes putting that work in up front to create like kind of this like super polished but slightly hand wavy design prototype can be the thing that people are like, yeah, let's do this. And you're like, okay, it's going to be really hard, but now you've got this momentum behind you, and that can be enough or create enough space to kind of do those engineering prototypes of like, we actually have a lot of really difficult things to figure out. We don't know what we don't know yet, but it's worth doing because we kind of have this kind of like North Star of where we're trying to get to. And I think there's like different levels of that. And then, yeah, once you've kind of got that excitement, you can then get into the weeds and figure out all of that kind of nitty gritty stuff. I think where we've fallen down is where we try and like propose answers to all those things up front, but you can't possibly know until it's actually built in code.
So. I think one other sort of prototyping piece you're talking about, like the building excitement around it. I think sometimes there's just like everyone is not on the same page about whether something is going to be good or not. And we have a feature that we've been thinking about for a bit, and I don't want to say controversial, but like some people think, oh, that's really cool. And some people think, I don't get it. Why would that be useful? And then we build an engineering prototype and show it to a couple people, and they're like, oh, I totally get it now. That is really cool. Or in this case, that's what they said, but they could also have said, okay, now I get it and I still don't like it. But that's like just such a good way to do some more of that validation as well. So like the excitement could come from like a good prototype, like vision showing you here's where we want to go, but it could also come from like try this thing out yourself a little bit and see what you feel after like you've been the one to like click around and try how this works. And that's just like another I think like, especially from the engineering perspective, like a really cool way for engineers to help make a case for like, on our team, we have a lot of engineers who feel very passionately about specific features or things that they want to work on. They're working on dev mode. Of course, they like have strong opinions about what will be useful, but it's not always easy to like pitch something in the abstract. But when you have a bit of a prototype, or you have something where you can show here's a little bit more of how it would actually feel or work, that can be a really good way to build alignment around that feature, or just validate whether or not it is a good idea. We've definitely had some things where it's the other way, where you try something out and you're like, yeah, this actually doesn't work. Maybe we were really excited about it, but upon a little more prototyping or exploration, we realized like, yeah, this doesn't feel right. This is not going to be the right way to do this. So I think it's really important to like have the space to be able to try out different things and use that to help you validate. You don't have to like write a doc every time to tell a story about like the thing that you want to work on. Prototyping can be a really good tool for that.
Essentially, it kind of feels like the silo problem being demolished from the outset, and everybody kind of sitting closer together, maybe literally or synchronously. From a designer perspective, someone who's maybe not in that environment, what advice would you give to a designer who wants to build this communicative culture, who wants to get closer to the process, who wants to unblock these prototypes? Where would they start?
Always share the URL. It's kind of the baseline of what I tend to tell teams. I think it was either you, Noga, or you, Peter, earlier, who mentioned that sometimes it can be difficult for folks to share their work in progress very early on. And that's something that I do see in a lot of the teams that we get the opportunity to work with, is there is a bit, I feel like the theme of this discussion underlying is trust, basically. So if there's one takeaway, is that process is a lot about trust. But yeah, like this feeling of trust needs to start with somewhere. And I think having the courage to take that first step and just start with sharing wherever we're at can be that stepping stone for other teams to then join in, then chip in. It can start as simple with just adding comments or just answering on a Slack or Microsoft Teams or whatever the instant messaging platform can be. And just little by little bringing people in, and then maybe other people are going to start bringing their ideas. Maybe they're going to start riffing off it. Maybe an engineer will take the subject and build their own proof of concept on this. But I just feel like, yeah, sharing early, sharing as early as possible, and always share the URL. Every single place you can impact or access stakeholders is sort of the most important thing.
From the engineering perspective, how do you build a design-curious organization?
Yeah, it was just what I was going to say. I think like curiosity is exactly the word. I feel like if I was on a team that's more siloed, what I would encourage people to do is to ask other functions more questions about their work, like what's challenging about what you're trying to do. Try to really get to the bottom of what are we trying to build together, and what every person brings to the table and what they have to deal with. Again, like maybe they have a more strict process, or their manager has certain expectations of them. Maybe they have to prepare for a design crit, and that's really stressful for them. So I feel like the more you can understand where the other person is coming from, that can help bridge the gap. And then once things are on the table, it's usually a lot more easy to collaborate. Like once you know where a person is coming from, what are they trying to do, what are you trying to do together, and where are the differences, it's easier to take it from there.
Great. I think that's a lovely place for us to finish. Start with maybe a paper napkin, end with an engineering prototype, build trust in your team, communicate and meet in the middle. We'll see you in the next video.